All right, everybody, thank you for coming. I'd like you all please to mute your phones. So everybody take your phones out right now and mute them. Thank you. And I remember to do mine, including the congressman. To keep things going smoothly, we'd like you to write your questions for Congressman Foster on the index cards that were provided, unless you brought your own. We do have a stack. If you think of a question during the event, just take that card, write down your question, and wave it in the air, and we'll have people who will grab that from you. Please do not call out your questions. We're just trying to keep things going smoothly and get everybody's questions in. So the volunteers will be offering index cards for those of you who don't have it. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Congressman Bill Foster. Congressman Foster represents the 11th Congressional District of Illinois. He's a scientist and a businessman, and he's the only PhD physicist in Congress. Congressman Foster serves on the House Financial Services Committee, where he helped create several important reforms in the financial services and housing market. He is also the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions and Monetary Policy. Congressman Foster served on the House Select Subcommittee on coronavirus, examining the federal government's response to the COVID-19 crisis, including the use of taxpayer funds to mitigate the public health and economic consequences of the pandemic. Previously, Congressman Foster served on the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, where he fought for evidence-based policies to issues including climate change and energy innovation. He continues to champion for federal funding for scientific research. He also served as the chairman of the Science Committee Investigation and Oversight Subcommittee, which is empowered to investigate and oversee federal scientific research. Before he became a member of Congress, he worked as a high-energy physicist and was a particle accelerator designer at Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. We all know that as Fermilab. He was a member of the team that discovered the top quark, the heaviest known form of matter. He also led the teams that designed and built several scientific facilities and detectors still in use today, including the anti-proton recycler ring, the latest of Fermilab's giant particle accelerator. And he started young. When he was 19, Congressman Foster, wasn't congressman at that time, and his younger brother co-founded the Electronic Theater Controls Incorporated, a company that now manufactures over half of the theater lighting equipment in the United States. Congressman Foster lives in Naperville with his wife, who is also a physicist, and they have 2 adult children. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Congressman Foster.
Well, thank you. And before I get started, I want to thank Indivisible McHenry County for putting together today's event and for their continued advocacy. And of course, thank all of you for being here on a really beautiful day when there are other beautiful things to do. I understand how scary these times are for so many of you, including many of you who may rely on the very federal programs that the Trump administration is threatening. And that's why I have and I will continue to host town halls like this, both in person, over the phone, and online, to ensure that you all know what I'm doing in Washington on your behalf. Trump and the congressional Republicans are targeting Medicare, they're targeting Medicaid, SNAP, and many other essential programs in order to pay tax cuts for their billionaire donors. And whenever we're debating something in Washington, almost all the time when you just break it down and say what's at the core of this, it is the question of whether we're going to do something that will increase or decrease the maldistribution of wealth in our country. And that's very often the core of this. And that's true of essentially every one of the major bills that the administration has jammed through the Congress. We're also fighting Trump in the courts, where judges so far have largely blocked his illegal actions. The jury is still out on many of these. It's the lower courts, not the Supreme Courts, that block these, and so we'll be finding out in the coming months. But that's the first line of defense. Now, Congress cannot directly, we're not a party to these, but what we can do is sign on amicus briefs that have supported successful lawsuits against Trump and his illegal actions. What happens is that in many of these cases, what you're looking at this piece of legislation says, what was the intent of Congress? And we can say, okay, this was our intent when we passed this. And so these amicus briefs have been cited by many of the legal victories that we've had, but we're not going to win all the fights. And my Democratic colleagues and I stood firmly in opposition to the Republican budget and voted no on the bill that's going to throw millions of Americans off their health care and gut the food assistance for those who need it the most. And right now, my Democratic colleagues and I are fighting to prevent a Republican funding bill that would raise health premiums for hundreds of thousands of people in Illinois. When I'm back here in Illinois, I have stood with many of you at protests such as the No Kings Day protests and other peaceful demonstrations across our district to show our anger and frustrations that we all feel at this time. I've hosted roundtables with advocates and organizations that were directly impacted by the Trump administration. Organizations like local food banks, public school superintendents, local librarians, small business owners, you name it, the damage is widespread. Local manufacturers. And I also want to assure you that Congress, is that, okay. Oh, here, okay, this was not me hallucinating here. Okay. All right. Well, here, what I'll do is I'll try to do better at bringing it closer to my. Okay, and then now you can turn the volume down, and I will. Okay. Anyway, I just want to assure you that in Congress, we're using everything at our disposal to fight back against Trump and the Republicans. Reckless cuts to services that so many people need, but really everyone has a piece in this fight. I'm so glad to see so many folks today engaged on the issues that matter. It's very often when you're frustrated, you say, okay, we have all these protests, and what good did it do? I just want to say, after the No Kings rally, that was side by side with Trump's military birthday party, that was not so well attended. I often, when we're coming and going to votes, I often get in elevators. We're all jammed into elevators, and sometimes I get jammed into elevators by accident with a group of Republicans where they don't notice. I'm an old white guy, so I kind of can pass for a Republican. And so all of a sudden, they'll just start talking candidly. And there was some very interesting, candid, worried talk about, geez, did you see how horrible the crowds were at the president's rally? And how many of these No Kings did you have in your district? And he said, I had 5 in mine. I think I personally had like more than 10. And I want to apologize for every one of these rallies I don't get to stop in on because, the district is, I don't know if you've seen this map, but the way I describe it is, when people ask me, Bill, where's your district? I say, okay, you get off the plane in O'Hare, you drive 45 minutes in any direction, and you're either in my district or you're in Lake Michigan. It's this giant arc, sort of roughly around O'Hare, and it goes all the way from Belvedere to Lamont. And so it's, so I spent a lot of time driving up and down Route 47 and so on. Anyway, so I want to thank you again for coming out, and let's get to all of your questions.
These are going to be in no particular order, so we're going to make you do a dance, okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah,
first,
it's not bad for efficiency if you clump them. If they're like one issue that you have 4 different cards on. If you read all the ones on one issue, then
if we can do that, we will.
Sometimes that works better. But
right.
You have editorial license to order them how you wish.
But we'll start with this first question. What is Congress working on to prevent future presidents from using the Supreme Court as his or her own personal jury and judge for any issue they want shoved through?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we painfully suffer through, is the fact that the Supreme Court is vetted by a Senate, which sort of by design is not well centered on the United States. A voting majority in the Senate is held by 25 or 29% of the people. It's dominated by the low population rural states. And so that's the reason that we have the Supreme Court we have. If there were any more directly democratic selection of Supreme Courts, we would not have had a court that decide that it's time to destroy a woman's right to choose and everything else that's happened. But we're left with a Senate that we have, and the design of it. You know, this was, frankly, I blame the founding fathers. They deliberately overrepresented the low population states as a favor to the slave states. The slave states did not have a lot of people that they wanted to vote, and if they voted by population, then they weren't going to be heavily represented. And so that is, in order to get the slave states to agree to the whole concept of the U.S. Constitution, they had to agree to a Senate that's pretty badly screwed up. And so this is something we've been struggling with. You'd see, we struggle with it, you know, from the point of view of the ideological balance of the court being off-center with the United States, and also the fact that large population states get screwed. And this is a big issue with me, and I'll go on with it if we start talking about money issues. But basically, much of the spending and tax bills you see coming out of the Senate do enormous favors to the low population states that dominate the Senate and screw large states like Illinois. Illinois loses between 20 and $40 billion a year because we pay a lot more in federal taxes than we get back in federal spending, and that's courtesy of the Senate. Anyway, that's part of the problem with the Supreme Court. There is a long list. I think most members of Congress have a long list. I personally have a Google spreadsheet with every time I read something that says, God damn it, we need a law to prevent this in the future, and we don't have a law. Because what's happened is that we have, in many situations, a system that's built with the assumption that someone of goodwill will be running the show. Right? And when that is no longer true, as it unfortunately is right now, we are very poorly defended against a lot of the damage that can be done. You know, where you all probably are outraged by the same things that are just daily drumbeat of these. And so that's one of the many things that I think we have to fix. Now, the Supreme Court, you know, I'm not a lawyer. It turns out there's no shortage of lawyers in Congress. And so they have long lists of constitutional amendments and laws that they'd like to do to try to prevent some of the abuses. We need to have a clear understanding of when administrations can use their judgment for political reasons, and then when we have to draw red lines. And those are pretty hard to define, actually, because, you know, there are times when, the President of the United States had called in federal troops to prevent violence on school desegregation. You know, as you may know, my dad was very involved in that. Dad wrote a lot of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the biggest steps forward for human rights in our country's history. But it was not, anyway, then there's a huge ethical problem. I'll just finish the Supreme Court with a huge ethical problem. It's inexcusable that we don't have ethics standards for the Supreme Court that are as high or higher than those that Congress imposes on itself or the presidency.
Okay, next question. People with disabilities have a civil right to live in the community, but have only a legal right to institutions. Thank you for sponsoring the LaTanya Reeves Freedom Act. What is Congress and Democrats prepared to do to codify body autonomy, parentheses, abortion, and other civil rights?
Yeah, okay, well, that includes 2 or 3 issues, right? There's the issue of treating people with disabilities fairly. I mean, you know, we've got a president that thinks it's a disgrace to have wounded warriors in military parades. I don't know if you'd seen that he thought it was a bad look in a military parade to have a wounded warrior. You know, okay, that's un-American. It is so far, I'm often struck that this is so far from the greatest generation that we're seeing out of this White House. He just thinks that, it's, it's not me, so it's not something that matters. And so this is why you see a lot of the things that we fought for to get rights for those who are disabled. One of my proudest here, one of the things we have these community project funds, and we have a big list of proposals for these. And there's down, right where I live, there's a river walk along in downtown Naperville, and it is inaccessible to ADA to those in wheelchairs. And it wouldn't cost that much to fix it, and when I had this big list of things, I said, look, we should fix that. And there are just many things that, it involves a lot of what's sometimes called the lottery of the womb. That I believe that the laws we write should be laws that we would happily agree to before we were born, if we did not know that we would be born disabled or born wealthy or poor, that we should just make a set of rules that are fair for everyone. And life is not going to be fair, but we have to do something to make life more fair for those who start life from an unfair position or have something happen to them. And so the other thing is, abortion. This has been one of the things I've been fighting hard and long. I first took office in 2008 in the special election against Dennis Hastert. And one of the things that got me going is that he was a very strong voice, and he used his power as Speaker of the House to prevent votes that he thought he was going to lose on a woman's right to choose. Okay, and he just one of my heroes in this whole business is Melissa Bean, who went and defeated a long-serving, very anti-choice Republican incumbent, the first person to ever win any one of the collar counties as a Democrat in my lifetime. And it was frankly, the fact that she won that was the only reason I even tried. But she was doing this over a woman's right to choose. There are many things wrong with the Bush administration, but it was just the fact that that the area that she was raising her daughters in, just was being badly represented by someone who was on the wrong side of that issue. Since I've gotten into politics, I entered into this with a scientist sort of, that's, I don't know. Oh, oops. Okay, got to hold it closer. What I was trying to say is that I've actually, in my time, become more tolerant of those with other opinions on a variety of things. On the issue of choice, for example, I'm strongly pro-choice. You can look at, I vote down that side every single time. But when people come to me, and I don't think there's a scientific way to say that, when life begins, and the way it was explained to me actually by a Republican finally said, okay, look, here's the best way you guys, being Democrats, can understand that issue. Imagine that you're in a society, you're plunked down from a spaceship into a world where they just think it's perfectly fine to kill children at the age of 12, okay? And you would probably devote your life to try to change that behavior. Okay, and so that's the way Republicans feel. They think that that a newly fertilized egg is equivalent to killing a 12-year-old child. I think there's a huge difference in that, but there's no scientific principle as to where you draw that line. And so I think it's something that we have to negotiate among society, and that's what Roe versus Wade was. It was a compromise that we lived with for 50 years, and it was just a tragedy of history that got blown up. So. Anyway, I am more respectful, frankly, than some of my colleagues on this, but on the other side. But I'm going to vote that way every way I can, every time I get a chance.
Okay. Thank you. We have several questions that are very similar, so I'm going to group these. What are you doing about ICE's inhumane treatment of families in Illinois, including U.S. citizens? Why weren't ICE agents arrested when they broke down the door of an apartment building without a warrant to arrest alleged illegal immigrants? I do not believe that ICE is a replacement for common sense immigration legislation. Is Congress continuing to draft immigration reform and fight for its passage? What measure will you support to increase congressional oversight of ICE operations, particularly in sensitive locations like schools, hospitals, and in places of worship? And what can we as individuals do to oppose deportation without due process? And finally, what steps can your office take to demand greater transparency from ICE regarding its operations, especially regarding incident reports, detention conditions, and enforcement activities in Illinois?
Yep. Well, I mean, the whole situation with ICE is a perfect example of where we don't have laws that are specific enough about where their jurisdiction ends. And so this is it's one of the things that occurs on everyone's list. We have to, you need something like ICE to maintain control of the immigration system. You need some enforcement mechanism, but we have to be very much more clear than we are right now, is that has to operate under the rule of law, and we have to write down what those rules are. They're clearly not being enforced. I represent Aurora, okay, and when Trump first got elected, I had school principals come to me almost in tears because they were having to send kids home because the kids were not vaccinated, and they were not vaccinated because the parents were terrified if they'd come and vaccinate their kids, that ICE would come and get them. And the level of terror that's being deliberately sent by, this is a matter of, it's not an accident. It doesn't mean they're not being sloppy. They are being recruited in ways, with messaging on the recruiting that makes it absolutely clear that their mission is to make life hell for a big set of people that are doing important jobs. And when we ever come to a deal on this, then they ought to be allowed to remain safely and legally in this country. There are tens of thousands of people that I represent that are in my district. They don't vote for me, despite what people say, but they're in my district, and they often have family who are mixed status. And so this is, I know, it's really hard when they come to me and say, Bill, tell me what you're doing to stop this, because I don't want to lie to them. It is darn hard in our current situation. We understood how bad it would be when the big beautiful bill produced $70 billion of money specifically for ICE, because they have been limited to what they can accomplish by the fact that we negotiated relatively limited budgets for ICE enforcement. With $70 billion, they can do things that we never dreamed of, and they're unfortunately doing it all over. So. All right, and one of these questions in that stack there was, what is Congress doing on actually coming up with a workable system on this? And it is one of the tragedies of history that we did not pass the 2013 Comprehensive Immigration Reform. And what that bill was, it passed through the Senate with, I think, something like 3/4 of the vote of the Senate, of a strong bipartisan majority. And then if we had been allowed to vote for it in the House, it would have passed by 30 votes. I was working at the time with Luis Gutierrez, who was in Congress at the time, and we were going around getting private commitments from Republicans that once in their life they would take a bullet and vote for the comprehensive immigration reform deal. And what that deal was is the deal that's available today with most Republicans if you just talk to them in a quiet moment when the cameras aren't on. And that is that, okay, we will have, a one-time pathway to legality, at least, for the 12 million or so people who are here undocumented, who have no criminal history, and pass a background check, pay a fine for violating our laws, pay their back taxes, all that sort of stuff. But then they will be given some sort of legal status to stay here, so they won't have to live in their shadows, and they don't have to be intimidated by their bosses every time the boss wants to get something from them. But on the other side, so we'll have that. But on the other side, after that, we will have real enforcement of E-Verify, that it will become a really significant penalty if you hire someone that is not legal to work here. Because if you look at countries that have a lot less trouble with border control, it's because their enforcement point is at the workplace. And what we have in the United States is we have a lot of employers who sort of enjoy the situation they're in, where they can sort of nod and wink and, oh yeah, well that's a fake Social Security number, but we won't ask. And they're taking advantage of the very low wages that desperate people are willing to come here and work for. And that's not a well-run system. And so that the other side of that coin was that we would have real workplace enforcement. And I think that is the deal that should still be available, that a tough but fair path to at least legal residence and eventually citizenship, and in return for real enforcement of E-Verify. And I think that's the end point we want to get to. Because we don't want to be sitting there, and frankly, the Biden administration made some mistakes by sort of sending a signal that you could just show up in the United States, it doesn't matter, you'll be able to stay there indefinitely. The truth of the matter is that if we opened our borders to the whole world, half of the world would be here tomorrow, all right? And that's the reality. And so what we need is a legal and rational way to control the number and situations of people that we allow to come live here. And that can be done, and we got to get back to it.
Okay,
anyway,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next set of questions all have to do with the shutdown, so I'll read through them. The government shutdown, specifically. Let's see, first, 3 Democratic senators voted to keep the government open. Do you believe the rest will stay united, or are there some more leaning towards reopening now? That's the first question. Second question, how long do you envision the shutdown will last? Do you think the Democrats will hold firm on tax credits for ACA reversal of Medicaid cuts? How do we get out of the government shutdown if Trump declares martial law? And how do we have an election then? What actions do you want to see taken in Congress? How confident are you that Democrats will stand strong against the budget, the big, beautiful budget bill? With Republicans refusing to negotiate over the shutdown, what do you see as the path forward? And how can we as citizens help to move things forward? Bipartisanship in Congress as a whole has gotten progressively worse, especially since Newt's contract with America. We are at a stalemate now. Do you see an end to it, or will this be us or them, or will this us or them be the new norm? And those all kind of relate to the shutdown and what's going on.
And just the nature of Congress right now. Well, first, in terms of the 3 senators, we had a lot of discussion of this going into the shutdown, is how many senators would be able to stand strong against this. And the estimate that we were given, all of these are transmitted through Hakeem, who goes and has leadership meetings with the Senate. And he said there would be 2 or 3 and no more than that. And that's kind of what's happened. And he, in fact, correctly told us who they were going to be. And so, Ben, I believe there are similar conversations inside the Senate, and it is the belief that's being transmitted to us is that's it. That everyone who was going to, to vote to, ignore everything that's about to happen to health care is, they are done. We also have had a very, very strong and I think to me very refreshing and convincing internal discussions. Because the situation we're in is there are 1,000 outrages that we could legitimately be fighting about, and everything, human rights, just name it, everything that's being done, science policy, if I was going to name an issue. But what we have to do as a matter of tactics, the battle we must win is to reclaim control of the House in the midterm elections. And in order to do that, every time we open our mouth, we should be talking to persuadable voters in winnable districts, okay? So I'm talking about the 2 districts across the border in Wisconsin, all right? There are 2 districts in Iowa that we have a decent shot at. And those are locally, that's where I'm putting my efforts. This is not supposed to be a political meeting, but you understand what I'm doing. That is, and then what that means for Democrats is that we have to focus the way we talk about this issue in ways that will be persuadable to persuadable voters in swing districts. Okay. Now, and what that means is a lot of these, persuadable voters are voters that, frankly, they don't pay that much attention to politics. I imagine most people in the room spend more time than they should staring at their screens and swearing at the president. But you're not persuadable voters, right? And so the persuadable voters are ones that are really just very busy with their lives, and they haven't taken time to learn politics. They haven't yet appreciated the damage that politics can do if they go off the rails, the damage that can do to their lives and ones they care about. And so that they are just, I don't want to disparage them in any way, because most of when you talk to them, they're just people really busy. They're holding down 2 jobs. They're doing, they're trying to keep it together in a world where that's not easy, in an economy where that's not easy. So we have to talk to them in simple terms that they can understand in 1 or 2 sentences. And that's why after a lot of internal debate, we said, okay, the issue that 100% of us agree on is the damage to health care. And that is something that could end the health care costs as part of the general failure of the Trump administration to control costs. Because that's something, a lot of people, when you said, why did you vote for Trump? He said, I know the guy is a rapist. I know that he is an evil person. And, I know that he's bankrupted most companies that he's ever run. Okay, but the economy was pretty good under him, which is, we can argue about how true that was, but that's what they believe, and that is how they will be voting next time. So now the opportunity we have is to say, look, he promised that health care was going to be so cheap and so good, we're all going to love it. Let's see what he's delivering. He promised that he would lower energy costs by a factor of 2 in his first 12 months in office. And he said that again and again. I'm sure you didn't watch all his speeches on the campaign trail, but that was a part of his stump speech for the last couple months. In detail, he was saying, I'm going to cut gas prices in half. I'm going to cut home heating costs in half. Everything that is not happening. And in fact, if you look at his policies, a lot of his policies are designed not to lower energy costs, but to increase energy profits for the fossil fuels that funded his campaign. For example, he brags about how he struck this deal with Europe, where Europe is now going to buy $1 trillion or $700 billion of liquefied natural gas from the United States. Great. What that means is the Europeans are now going to be coming into the U.S. natural gas markets and bidding up the price. That is not going to lower heating costs for Americans, or it's not going to lower manufacturing costs for plastics manufacturers that use the natural gas as a feedstock. And so, he is failing to deliver on his promise to lower costs. He was not going to stop inflation. He was going to lower costs and bring them back to where it was when he was in office. Okay, so we're talking about deflation was his promise, which would be a disaster if it actually happened. But that's what he promised, and that is hurting people. And we should talk about costs and the damage that is about to be done to health care if we lose this fight is something that's going to be real. 400,000 people in Illinois, depend on these tax credits, the Obamacare tax credits to pay for their health insurance. And what's going to happen overall, if due to the big beautiful bill, is 17 million people in America are going to lose their health care. Okay? And you say, okay, I don't care, I'm not one of them. They're the other people. Well, guess what? Those other people are going to end up showing up in an emergency room without insurance. And the insurance companies have to pay for it. They have to cover them, which is what they should do. But then they're going to have to cover those costs, and they're going to cover the cost by raising prices on everyone. And not just the government, not just Medicare and Medicaid, but private health insurance is going to go up because of the people he's kicking off health coverage. Overall, I think they take about $1.5 trillion out of healthcare spending by the government. All right, and when you take that much money out of the healthcare system, they're going to have to extract a comparable amount of money from people who are just paying insurance premiums. All right, and so when this happens, people are going to be even less happy than they are. So we have to make sure they understand who's on which side of this fight. And so that's what we've done. We've said, okay, this is about healthcare and costs, and nothing else. And then there was a very, very long plea from the leadership, from Hakeem and the leadership team, to say, okay, please, you're going to be going home to all your districts. You're going to be having town halls. Every time you open your mouth, please only talk about health care and talk about costs. And that's really, and that's painful, because there are so many things we all care about. I want to talk about human rights. I want to talk about the fact that we're wasting $200 billion on this golden dome that scientists have been explaining patiently for 40 years is never going to work. And now we're just going ahead and spending, I think, roughly $20 billion this year on a down payment on a system that by the end of the Trump's presidency is going to be around $200 billion. And so it just, anyway. But that's what I'd love to sit there and be wasting your time hearing about the Golden Dome and how it sucks. But I'm not supposed to be doing that. What I'm supposed to be doing is saying health care, high cost, health care, high cost. And I think that's the right message. And so I'll try to get back to that when I leave the town hall.
All right, so another group of a few questions. What is Congress working on to prevent future presidents from using the Supreme Court as his or her own personal jury and judge?
Yeah, we did, but it's...
well, never mind. How did that get over in the top?
Yep.
Ignore that one.
It's hard to ignore, but that's another one we had a big discussion. How can we ignore his assaults on the Constitution?
Right.
And the problem is that the persuadable swing voters that don't pay attention to politics, they don't much care about the Constitution. Okay, I wish they did. They don't. They care about the price of eggs. Okay, and so we have to talk to them about the price of eggs, and it's it's hard. It's hard, but I think it's the right play, because the thing we cannot do is lose the next election.
Okay. A group you haven't seen. The political norms have changed. What are you and your staff doing outside of your comfort zone to get the truth out? Why are Democrats not going on Fox and other right news shows? Republicans are on MSNBC and CNN all the time. Why doesn't the Democratic Party attempt to solicit celebrity influencers to support and promote Democratic candidates up and down the ballot? Protesters are out every day in different locations. Where are Republicans in Congress? Are they fearful? So are we, but we are public and visible. Dem leadership is lacking in this area. Do you think that protests make a difference? Why are the Democratic parties not answering every rotten lie from the lying Republicans on TV? No value there. And taking news stations they can, and any news stations that they can. What can be done to stop the Trump administration from their vindictive retaliation against Democratic areas? And going forward, I want to ensure that the rule of law is followed by all branches of government. I also want the checks and balances among the executive, judicial, and congressional balances restored. Is amending the Constitution the only way to accomplish these goals? If not, what other means do you suggest?
You can do a lot with a better set of laws. For example, the reason that Trump is abusing the tariff laws is that Congress passed laws to let him do it. The Constitution's very clear that Congress is in charge of tariffs, all right? And we, unfortunately, pass laws. The history of that, it's always useful to understand why did we get into this mess. We got into that mess because originally Congress was in charge of tariffs, and Congress spent a huge amount of time arguing with itself over tariffs. Should we protect the U.S. milk industry or the U.S. steel industry? And the congressmen or the senators from this and that state would just had huge fights. And we said, look, this is not working. Let's give it to someone who has the best interests of the whole United States at heart. That was the thinking to transferring a lot of the authority for deciding the details of tariffs to the presidency. And it worked until it didn't work, okay? And now this, we're just, and now it's not at all clear. This may be one of the areas where we could win in the courts, and it could happen relatively soon. The legal people that I talk to, that I respect on this, think there's a 50-50 chance he's going to lose the tariffs that he's been using. That will change everything in his abuse of our allies. because it's one of the things that I get struck with all the time in his behavior internationally is that this guy is a real estate dealer and he is not a manufacturing businessman, okay? And I'm a manufacturing businessman, and as a manufacturer, I know the last thing you want is a pissed off customer. He revels in the fact that he has screwed his counterparty in deal after deal after deal. He thinks he is being a big success when his counterparty goes away angry, okay? And maybe you can do that in real estate dealing, where it's a series of one-off transactions and you'll never deal with them again. You cannot treat our allies that way. And what he is doing, he is burning through political capital that has taken generations, including the greatest generation's loss of life, protecting Europe, and they no longer trust us. I am just shocked at when I talk to my European scientific colleagues. They just have had it with the United States. When I talk to some business colleagues, that the Europeans just don't want to buy American stuff, and that's hurting American factories and workers a lot because and it's not just Europe. My wife is Korean, all right? And you know what they did with this immigration raid on the Korean battery factory in Georgia, where, and that is all over Korean social media. These are Korean workers that came over to install the equipment because they were experts on it, so they came in as subcontractors. And then they find themselves arrested, put in shackles and chains. The Koreans have not seen their citizens in shackles and chains since the Japanese occupation, okay? And they're just saying, the hell with it. We're just not gonna, they're in the process of what they have promised to, order of $10 billion of new manufacturing capacity, what's going to be built by Korean companies, and they're just saying, the hell with it. And so this is the sort of damage that's being done with the attitude of this guy that sees everything as a deal to be made to screw his counterparty. So that's the one issue. Let's see. Could you give me a quick review of what a couple of those?
I think the question was, what can Democrats do?
What can we do? Okay, don't discount the value of the protests. All right, that has a, I often think back to my father, my dad, he was a civil rights lawyer, okay, and he was a white guy, and so that he didn't have a natural home there, but what Dad did is there was 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education and before the Civil Rights Act, where the Supreme Court had decided that we should not have separate racially segregated school systems, and many areas of the country were sort of giving the finger to the Supreme Court, all right? And so that Dad spent that decade traveling around the South, understanding how are you going to deal with Brown versus Board of Education, and he serves as sort of an advance man for the Justice Department of the United States. And he would go ahead and he'd go into some southern county. Dad had grown up in Tennessee, so he could turn on the southern accent and have everyone trust him. And so he would go in and he said, how are you all dealing with Brown versus Board of Education? And then he would listen to them, and then he'd write back memos to the Justice Department saying, in this one county, there is the guy who runs it he's a guy who understands the tide of history, and if you can have Robert Kennedy or Burke Marshall, whoever's running the Civil Rights Division, have him give him a call, and if you can get him on your side, then it'll be fine. But in this other county, just forget it, bring in the troops and file suit. And that's why, when the Civil Rights Act passed, he was called upon to write the regs, the federal regulations, the nuts and bolts about how you actually implement this. And because of those regs, in the year after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, more schools were desegregated than in the 10 years beforehand. But what made the difference in his mind, and he would go to these conferences that were held by Reverend Hesburgh in Notre Dame, who was a big civil rights activist, and he would hold these conferences where lawyers from all over the country would get together and design different versions of the Civil Rights Act. And people would laugh at them. They'd say, this is stupid. There's no way the Senate is ever going to pass the Civil Rights Act. And then what happened was, Selma, and everything that happened, the abuses in the South, and the whole public just stood up and said, this is bullshit. This is not the way America should be. And he said it was like someone threw a switch. and that all of a sudden his phone started ringing off the hook with, hey, I'm a senator, I want to put something forward on civil rights. You know, these senators with Southern accents would call him up, and all of a sudden he was in huge demand. And that was because of public pressure. And so that, don't discount that. You know, the story I said about the Republican nervous reaction to the difference with the King Days protests versus Trump's birthday party, that was something that Republicans noticed. And so so I want to thank you for 5,000 people up in McHenry County. Yeah, yeah, which is, you know, I didn't think there were, yeah, that's right. And so that's right. And so that actually has an effect. You know, you can't draw the straight line to it, but what it means is that these Republicans will be retiring a little bit earlier. They will be voting a little more timidly. They will be more willing to come up with compromises on some things. You know, but it has to reach the point, frankly, where they're more afraid of losing the general election than of losing the primary election because Donald Trump has tweeted an opponent and funded an opponent for them. And that is the, you know, since there's no visible moral core based on any morality, self-interest seems to be the way you predict their behavior. And that's the way you flip that, by letting them understand that they're about to lose elections in a way they've not seen, you know, since 2006.
I'm a little shocked that we didn't get any written questions about tariffs, but since you raised the topic, I'd like to slip in a quick question of my own, which is, does anybody in Washington know where $17 trillion that's been given to us is? Trump keeps talking about he's got $17 trillion.
Yeah, he thinks that every time we buy a foreign good, we are giving them money in return for nothing. Okay, that's you know, that's how he does that calculation. Okay. You know, it's sort of interesting. You know, the United States has been a very low tariff country for, you know, most of my lifetime. You know, and if you look at why, you know, at the financial crisis, you know, back in 2009 or so, our economy and the economy of the European Union were about the same size. And now we are nearly twice as big as the European Union. And then that's because our growth has been higher. And when people look at that, one of the big reasons is that the European Union is a very high tariff area. They protect. So they pay a lot for food because they protect their little local farmers with little tiny, you know, the French farmer has like 1 or 2 acres, and you try to stay alive as a corn, you know, if you try growing corn with 2-acre farmland around here, you're not going to do very well. And so it's, you know, but they protect them with all kinds of tariffs and protectionist things, and they do that for many, many industries. It means their whole economy is less efficient. Now, you have to be careful. Tariffs have a use. You know, we did some really dumb things in not tariffing, it's a good example, permanent magnet, you know, critical materials for permanent magnets. You know, it used to be right around here. In McHenry County, we built permanent magnets that were the best permanent magnets in the world at places like Arnold Magnets. And that was largely taken over by the Chinese, who went and subsidized their industry in 2 ways. First, with direct cash subsidies and so on. And secondly, by allowing them to dump all of their pollutants straight into the river, and we have to actually pay to have them taken care of properly. And so for both of those reasons, we largely lost the ability to make permanent magnets and permanent magnet motors, which is a huge risk to our economy and to you know, into national defense. And so we have to be wise about this. And it strikes me that everyone on Trump's economic team, they're either real estate dealers or they are financial people. There's not a single one who, I think as Elon Musk said during his Twitter storm against Trump, he said, you guys, you haven't built, you know, squat. And that was actually correct, you know? That when Elon Musk left the White House in disgust, he was the last one that had actually manufactured anything in their team, and you see it again and again in their behavior. Because any manufacturer will tell you, look, if I'm building a complex product like a car or like a, you know, name it, like electronic theater lighting equipment, you do it with a mixture of, you know, sheet metal and you know, wiring harnesses and paint and everything that's a mixture of things built in the United States and around the world. And every time you make a procurement choice, you make a make versus buy and a U.S. versus foreign thing. And you recognize, if you're a manufacturer, that no one's going to be 100% pure on this, and your economy won't work the best if they are. But what we need is someone really smart about the tariffs, and that's not any current occupant of the White House.
No, definitely not. Okay, these are all related. It appears that the president is both mentally and physically unwell. Why isn't the media and the Dems asking about this, as was the case with Biden? Is it up to Congress to require the president to step down due to impaired mental status? Do you think there is any chance of support for the 25th Amendment given Trump's escalation of insanity? I'm just reading them as they're written. What would be an act that Trump could be impeached on? Is there a Democrat who is ready and able to step up and lead the party?
Let's separate the last one. That's different. Look at one of the things I think we made a mistake on was right after January 6th. We had the opportunity to get a clear statement. Congress would have voted overwhelmingly for a finding of Congress that the president had violated the provision in the Constitution for providing aid to insurrectionists. Boom, and that he was therefore ineligible for federal office forever. And we could have done that. Instead, we sort of got greedy and we said, we're going to impeach him anyway, even after he's out of office. And I always was uncomfortable with that. I didn't speak about it publicly, but it was very uncomfortable. It seemed like that was a bridge too far, and it started the ability of Republicans to say, you guys are just suffering from Trump derangement syndrome, okay? Whereas if we would have said, what can we get, the maximum we can get Republicans at that point to agree to, it would have been that, and it would have prevented Trump ever from returning for office. So maybe I'm a bashful guy, but I'm not one of these don't take prisoners people, that if we can find an opportunity to get half a loaf, we should do it. And that was a missed opportunity on there. Now, we may come to a situation like that. Look, many of you have known people whose mental facilities are in decline, okay? And what happens, in my experience, my parents, my mother went through this, is that you're okay, and then you start having good days and bad days, and then there's mostly bad days, and then it gets very steep. If you look at, and that's what happened, frankly, to Joe Biden. Okay, that he was pretty good on the stump in the previous election, and not really so good in the last election, and so you can see a lot of Donald Trump on that same trajectory. Okay, that's, I think, something that if you just look at a video from him now and 5 and 10 years ago, it's not entirely the same person. And so the question is, looking forward, all right, 3.5 years from now, that's a long time when you started down that rapid curve. Democrats are not going to be the ones to make that call. It's going to have to be Republicans. They're going to have to say, and Democrats weren't willing to make that call on Joe Biden. And it's damned hard to, but that's what's, frankly, it's going to have to happen. And, maybe it will come. The people that know him the best are the people that work for them closely every day. And the problem is that anyone in that kind of role, as an advisor to the president or member of the cabinet, who are the people responsible for making that call under the Constitution, they have the best job they're ever going to have. And they know that if the president leaves office because they're no longer competent, that they probably will lose the job themselves. That is a very tough ask for anyone. Certainly a lot of Democrats did not pass that test in the last administration. It is a tough thing to ask you to do. So I'm not optimistic that we're going to find Republicans willing to do that. But on the other hand, I put a lot of effort into trying to maintain decent, not perfect, but decent relationships with some of the reasonable Republicans that I have to work on the committees that I'm on. And, they are many of them, the most decent ones, are sort of in despair about where their party is going. But they understand they're in a box that they can't escape from, that if they speak publicly about everything they're unhappy about, that there will be a well-funded primary opponent and they will be out of an office. And so what they're saying is that, well, what I am fighting for and whatever their issues are is more important that I continue in my political career than I do the right thing for my country. And that is it's not just Republicans that tell that to themselves. And anyway, it's tough. I don't want to, when I say that I maintain good relationships with, one of the ways I maintain good relationships with them is I refuse to ever read their social media that they do back home, because then I cannot look them in the eye and think of them as reasonable human beings. But, that's part of the box they're in. And anyway. But they're also, I entered Congress when there was an emergency, when the financial crisis. I entered in March of 2008, and then Lehman Brothers fell in October 2008, and I was put on Financial Services Committee. And so I was, right there at ground zero when all of a sudden the Bush administration had wrecked the economy, and Democrats had to provide votes to save our economy. And by bailing out the banking system and doing all these things, bailing out the automobile executives who flew down, remember when they flew in their private jets to beg for hundreds of millions of dollars of money to save their companies, and I had to vote for all that. But in those, you had to strike deals with really, with Republicans on that, because you weren't going to get all the Democrats to vote for it, you weren't going to get all the Republicans to vote for it, but it was an emergency, and we had to save the country and its economy. That could happen any day again, and you have to, the situation with Taiwan has the hell scared out of me. The situation with, it's a long list of things, and at some point, you might need emergency actions by bipartisan groups in Congress, people, and that's why part of my job is to at least, have speaking relationships with these people. And then come back here and tell you what I really think.
And the follow-up question to that is there a Democrat who is ready and able to step up and lead the party? Well,
I have, the answer is yes, and this is not a political thing, so I don't want to, I don't want to advocate for a specific. There are, you have to have a really very fast-moving and wide-ranging brain to do the presidency right. I am surprised at how many different issues I have to think of every single day. The political side, the international side, the technological side, and it's only worse for the president. And so you want someone like, Barack Obama had a big enough brain to handle all aspects of the job. I think actually Jimmy Carter did as well. Richard Nixon had a big enough brain, but he just abused it. It was evil. And so it's but that's one real requirement. And so there are a handful of people that I think, and our governor, for example, is smart enough to manage the country. There are other good governors around, the Democratic governors, that I think could do a great job. The nice thing about governors is that they can run administrative organizations. The problem is we've been tending to select senators a lot, and the danger there is, even if you're running a Senate office which is 50 people. It's not the same as running the government of the state of Illinois, where you've got an enormous number of things. And then you have people that have served in government in other ways, like Pete Buttigieg ran, the Department of Transportation, which is a huge organization, and did a pretty good job of it. And he also has a brain more than big enough for the job. So there's lots of people there that can do this. Democrats.
Okay, this next set of questions all have to do with the midterms. And many of our people present today are concerned about whether you think there's even going to be midterms. Will Trump try to do something to stop them? Do you feel that it's possible for them to be held in a fair way? Will the Republicans try to seize ballots in Democratic districts to change the outcome? And what do we need to do to ensure that the midterms are fair and the Democrats have a fair shot at winning?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of observations. The most important thing is to make sure that local and state governments work as well as they can. Okay? Because if people see locally that democracy is a system that works well, then they will fight to preserve it in our country. Okay? And so that was always my advice immediately after Trump got back into office. He said, okay, there are municipal elections coming up. Get involved there. And, you know, frankly, we had some pretty astounding results down in, I think, well, that's a little bit political, but back in DuPage County, there were 39 contested races, and Democrats won every single one. Okay, and this is from a county that was as red as McHenry County in the recent past, and so this is. So concentrating locally. The other thing about our integrity, it's actually pretty hard to hack our elections, because the way they are set up is that you have poll watchers. You have Democratic and Republican poll watchers watching people that most of whom that they know show up, and so volunteering as an election judge and making sure that every polling booth in the country is staffed by people that are trusted by one party or the other. And then what happens is that they look at how the votes are counted in their precinct, and then they look up at the county website and say, yep, the votes are correctly scored. The votes from my precinct are correct on the county website. And then if they don't trust the votes being added up, you get out your spreadsheet and you add them up yourself. So there are lots of eyes on every step of that, and it's pretty hard to hack. Now, the thing you can do is to have people show up and say, okay, you're no longer on the voting file, and all this sort of games that are being played with the voting file, which is an ancient game all over the country. It's most frequently practiced, honestly, in the South, but it happens everywhere. And so that I think we just have to pay attention to ahead of time. And avoid these laws. Now, the other thing is that even if everyone who shows up and has their vote counted, if the gerrymandering gets really bad, and it is getting really bad, that's another thing that, but it's already been really bad. I mean, we were in a situation up in Wisconsin where on one election, they had gerrymandered the state legislature so badly that Democrats won like 60% of the votes, and Republicans still had a super majority because of their gerrymandering. And so it's, if you look what's done with Texas and, the number of Democrats versus Republicans that are elected there compared to what happens in the popular vote, it's way off. And so that's, then there's the debate about whether, one attitude to take on this when they're now gerrymandering, every state that they have a super majority in, Missouri, Indiana, a long list of states, that if they're going to do that, then should we retaliate or not? And that's the debate in California. It's actually a debate in Illinois. People think, oh, we're pretty far along, we can't do it. No, actually, we can do anything we want. You can just go into the state legislature, you can say, we are going to postpone the date of the election, we are going to change the map, and as long as it goes through with a majority, we can do it. We'll just be one of those states that has a late primary at this. And it's possible, during the last redistricting, some people drew maps that were 17-0. Right now the delegation's 14-3, 14 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and that you can draw a map where every single district has the same partisan tilt as the state as a whole. I think the state as a whole is like 7 points Democratic, so you win, 57 to 43. Typically, you can make it so every single congressional district is 57-43, and therefore every district ought to be won by a Democrat. You can draw a map like that, and the way you do it is you take the Chicago metro area and you cut it up like a pizza pie, where everyone has a little slice of downtown Chicago and a little slice and a big slice of cornfield with the right proportions to make it 7 points Democratic. So you can do this. This is what they're doing in Texas. And California didn't do it. California could have done it. California could make every single seat in California, and they had some limits to what they wanted, what they were willing to do, but they're not mathematical limits when you. Anyway, it's not. It's not cheating, but it's bending rules that ought to be stronger. I have been, signed on to every bill to get rid of gerrymandering nationwide. One of the actually encouraging things about humanity right now is that in states that have adopted nonpartisan redistricting commissions, they actually have produced fair maps. Because in reality, everyone knows on the redistricting commission who the Democrats and Republicans are for. But you get these citizens to come in, and they have to take an oath to act in a fair and nonpartisan manner. And it's like serving on a jury. You actually, you swear people in, and it's not like, okay, the criminal defendant here looks to me like he's not from my party, so I'm going to find him guilty. That behavior doesn't happen on juries, and it doesn't happen on redistricting committees. So that if we adopted that nationwide, I think there's some hope that things would get better. But
Okay. All right.
Anyway.
What can be done to stop the cuts to funds already approved? For example, green energy projects, infrastructure for Chicago and New York, et cetera.
That is going to be resolved in the courts. Yeah, it's resolved in the courts or through negotiations with the president. Right now, our leverage is limited. We will have enormous leverage if we end up winning the next election. We're in control of the House, at least in the next election, as then there will be many chips on the table. The only real leverage we have right now are a handful of Senate votes in the Senate and millions of people protesting. So both of those are going to be important.
This set of questions are about gender issues. What legislative strategies will you pursue to counteract potential federal or Supreme Court rulings that roll back protections for LGBTQ plus people? I have a trans granddaughter who is living her best life right now. What are you doing to ensure trans kids stay safe in Illinois? And finally, what is your stance on protecting Illinois healthcare providers who continue to offer gender-affirming care, including shielding them from legal challenges and penalties originating from other states?
Yeah, well, I'm very proud of what Illinois has done within the powers they have to protect not only trans people, but just all sorts of people are under attack. And we're going to be paying a price. I mean, Trump is targeting Illinois financially because we're not bending a knee to a lot of what he's doing. First off, I personally have signed on to what's called the Equality Act, which is sort of the signature piece of legislation that just says all of the everything that the Civil Rights Act provides for ethnic and religious and racial minorities applies equally to sexual gender ID, all this sort of stuff, which would solve most of these problems. When that gets passed, then the courts will have no choice but having to deal with a lot of these issues in a better way. And so obviously we don't have many Republican co-sponsors for that bill, but it's something that's going to have to happen. And I want to. It's one of the many things I want to apologize for. That's not going to be our lead issue in the coming election. And it's really, and it hurts because I come to a meeting and people are pleading me and telling me stories about their family or all sorts of things, whatever their special issue is. And we have to choose a small number of issues to talk about again and again and again. And it's not going to be gender equality. That is a fight that we fight after we win the next election. And then I will continue to be voting the right way. And so I understand it's tough, and I guess I'm asking for your understanding when you see the leadership and your elected representatives, acting like these sort of automatons, just saying it's all about costs and healthcare. We're shutting down the government to prevent increase of healthcare costs. That it doesn't mean we don't care about everything else, about human rights, about the independence of the Federal Reserve, everything else. Whatever it is, your issue is, We care about all that, but we're going to have to fight this one on winnable territory, and that means simple. So,
Okay.
so I want to thank you in advance for your understanding on that. You can express your individuality in the wonderful protest signs that I see at these protests. They're some of the really greatest signs I've ever seen.
We have some pretty creative people. The occurrence of mass shootings and incidences of violence continue to increase across the U.S. The current administration is addressing this issue by finger-pointing. How does the Democratic Party plan on addressing the escalation in violence?
Well, okay, point one, he brings in the troops to Washington, D.C. Right after a year where crime has hit a 30-year low, okay? And so he said, oh, it's an emergency, okay? So a lot of this stuff is not real. In Chicago, there's a real problem, but it's located in a very small number of communities where there's frankly a lot of gang violence. Chicago, outside of that, it's a pretty safe city, and I have a hard time keeping a lot of my staff from just wanting to live downtown. And it's just, the young kids still find it's a great place to live, and they're not terrified by, so, all right, so first thing, we have to push back against the disinformation. There's the things that are on the upswing are things where there are assault weapons and weapons of mass murder involved, okay? And that has to do with the fact that, once upon a time, there was a consensus that things like Tommy guns were illegal, I guess it was the Valentine's Day Massacre, I don't know the history, but that everyone agreed that, okay, Tommy guns should not be in the possession of ordinary people. And then we somehow decided, okay, you have these assault rifles that are things with large capacity magazines that are more lethal than a Tommy gun. And so that we decided those are okay, and it's not. I mean, every society has to have a threshold where you say, okay, at what point a weapon is too dangerous to have in private hands? For some societies, it's a knife, right? That you can only have a knife of a certain length, and so for other things that other countries have very few laws at all like we do. But you take one of these assault rifles and you shoot it at a human body, and the exit wound is like as big as a softball. Okay? All right? And these are designed to kill people in a war with the highest lethality possible. And the model that the founding fathers had for what they thought an armament should be, it's one of these things that if you were really good, you could get one bullet off every 30 seconds because you had to get the flintlock to, all set up again and clean out the barrel and all this sort of stuff. And imagine a modern battle with assault weapons versus flintlocks. It's not the same, it's not even close to the same standard of lethality. And so I think that if I were to interpret the Constitution, it would be the standard of lethality way. That in the times of the founding fathers, you could have guns, and a citizen could have a gun, but they could not have a cannon, for example. That those had to be held by militias, and so that with a cannon, if you're really good, maybe a 3-person crew can kill 10 people a minute with a gun, something like that, and it's all right. Compare that to a modern assault weapon; it's not even close. And so so if we draw the line at lethality, then I think you actually get something that will align itself better as technology changes and more dangerous weapons are invented. So anyway, I think you can tell where I vote on things like assault weapon ban.
We're kind of getting down to the last 10 or 15 minutes, and this last group of questions that we have, some of them are really specific, so
Okay.
it could be like maybe a lightning round.
A lightning round, okay, so I'll
There
try,
we go.
okay, yeah.
Do you have a position on the Israel-Palestine situation?
Oh, yeah, well, I've signed on to every ceasefire letter that since it started. I haven't signed on to, there's this Dilly Ramirez no bombs thing that I've not, Lauren Underwood and Sean and I all of not, because I think it amounts to a total ban on any military assistance at all to Israel. I think that just in terms of getting Israel to behave better, if you give them defensive weapons like the Iron Dome, they're more likely to behave better. But what they're doing is not we have a law already that's called the Leahy Law that is being violated. And this says you cannot use weapons provided by the United States in violation of the laws of war and international law. And so that's not being enforced. In fact, it was not really being enforced by the Biden administration either, to my mind. And we communicated privately that sentiment to the Biden administration, and they said, well, just don't worry about it, basically. And I don't know, it's hard to see those videos and not worry about it.
Right.
And the tragedy is that Benjamin Netanyahu has turned Israel into a pariah nation. And he has sort of systematically destroyed everything that I used to admire about Israel has been destroyed by Benjamin Netanyahu and his political party, and that's the nature of it. And so it's a tough, anyway.
Okay, this should be an easy one. How does the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7 impact groups like Indivisible and people who join them?
Okay, I'm going to need that translated. So what the Presidential Memorandum 7? What is that about? I don't read all of the executive orders. I sometimes read
We'll go on to another question.
I read the squeal of outrage.
We'll go on to another question while we ask that. Is there any way, these kind of go together, is there any way to enforce state rights, National Guards being deployed to our cities? I am deeply concerned about Pete Hegseth's attempt to restrict access to the free press to the Pentagon. How can these policy changes be stopped?
Yeah, okay, well, yeah, it's another example of, Hegseth, so just start with the Hegseth one. Unfortunately, the armed forces have a long-established principle to limit press access to the armed services, all right? And there has been tension in that forever. Because they want secrecy for very good reason in many of their operations. So as a matter of legal precedent, they have the ability to control press. Now and to limit press. They don't tell you, oh, we're going to send the troops in for some very specific secret mission. They don't make that public, and they do that by not letting the press. However, when you start using it for political opinion suppression, then that's where it gets tough. And this has been we've had this discussion in our country, for a long, long time. During World War II, there were huge debates about when you just have blunders by the Army, and then they try to keep the press from finding out about it. And so that, as a matter of law, I think there's very little we can do. As a matter of letting people know that it is being outrageously abused and be just another reason why you got to get this guy out of office, I think that's really what we can do on that one.
I think we're all in agreement on that one.
So what is the other?
Okay, so there
were two parts to that question.
The national presidential, the last one I just asked you about?
Yeah.
Pete Hegseth's attempt to restrict?
And there was two parts to the Hegseth one.
Is there any way to enforce state rights?
Oh, this has to do with bringing in National Guard and the Army into.
Yes.
Well, there's a piece of law. It has a weird name. It's a Posse Comitatus Act, I think, that says you can't bring in the armed forces in the United States. With exceptions that have to do with honest to God rebellions, which we're not in. Which is someone who's sitting there insulting the ICE personnel is not an insurrection. And so that is what they're trying to do when they haul in. And I think they're also, if they can do a lot if it's with the invitation of the governor. It's going to be quite a while before our governor offers an invitation to this administration to bring the federal troops in. And so, for example, what's happened, I think, in Tennessee, there was actually an offer into Memphis, was it? I think, and some of these, like Memphis has a much higher crime rate than Chicago, okay? And so maybe the governor is right to ask them to come in, but not Illinois, not now.
Yeah, this kind of goes along with what you were just talking about, that Presidential Memorandum Number 7 refers to the domestic terrorism and organized political violence. So basically, he's claiming the question was, how does that impact groups like Indivisible and people who join them? Could we be considered to be domestic terrorists?
You don't look like terrorists to me. He's going to lose that one in the court. I mean, this Supreme Court several times has come, if anything, come down farther on the. When you look at things like social media and stuff, they've come down farther on the side of free speech than I'm 100% comfortable with, because it's, we're about to have a really tough discussion on free speech and social media, and because a bunch of people are being hurt very badly by things said on free speech, and where what happens, when, for example, Florida, a state that I don't often use as an example, has banned social media accounts for kids under 15, all right? I actually, spiritually, I'm okay with that, but then it's going to go to the Supreme Court on the freedom of speech grounds, and it could get lost that way. And so, so we're going to have a bunch of tough discussions like that, and we have to, I guess, well, my first instinct is be a free speech absolutist, but I think there are also limits. And, the other thing is that if you're advocating for violence, that's a whole different thing. When President Trump went and said, well, the Second Amendment people should take care of the fact that Hillary Clinton was going to nominate a bunch of liberal judges, that's treading near thin. He's skating on thin ice with me when he says things like that. And so he often speaks sort of like a mobster, very right. There's some, everyone knows what he means, but there's some legal interpretation where it's not quite incitement to violence and stuff like this. But it's, and then there's the whole question of, do you want him to be a role model for your children? And that's the one I just find inconceivable that Republicans stay silent on. But that's what they do.
A couple questions here about your position on corporate money in politics.
Yeah, no, there's HR 1 was sort of says it all. It just did a number of things. It had, federally funded elections. It had, it got rid of Citizens United. The problem, one thing we have to acknowledge though, there's corporations are not the only problem. The other problem is billionaires. Okay, that a lot of the huge amounts of money that are polluting our democracy are not, Elon Musk's $20 million that he spent losing the race for Supreme Court up in Wisconsin, that was not a corporation, that was a person. And so the question is whether, sort of the principle of one person, one vote implies some kind of limit on unlimited political spending by a single individual as well as a corporation. And that's a tough decision, because if someone becomes a billionaire or has money, and then they want to spend money to encourage voters to vote for pro-environmental causes, are we going to say no? You're not allowed to spend your money that way? That's tough. But there's also a situation that worries the heck out of me is that you have these dead billionaires setting up these institutions with huge endowments that will sit there and pollute our democracy, so that our democracy will be operated by the dead hand of a billionaire that's passed away a long time ago. And I think that's got me worried a lot, because it's already in some sense happened. And so I think we just have to reset it. Lots of countries have very good democracies with much stronger limitations on how much money individuals and corporations can spend on campaigns. I think
Okay.
if we had, that's...
This is a quick question. Is Miller vote bond and Bondi covered under Trump's immunity? If not, can they be arrested for crimes committed on Americans?
I'm not a lawyer. I think you're not going to have the Justice Department, Trump's Justice Department, go after them. And it's really, one of the toughest things for me is this whole discussion of weaponizing the Justice Department. And because that is sort of one of the signature elements of an immature democracy, that whoever loses the election, the other says, oh boy, now I got control of all the prosecutors, I'm going to put you in jail. And they find something to put them in jail for. Sometimes it's real and sometimes it's not. And so, everyone has a long list of things where I think, just if you look at violations of the Hatch Act, where Trump is sitting there tweeting things on his he's announcing official actions on his privately owned social media account. That's just, way past any ethical norms. But are we really going to, whoever, assuming we get a president, a Democratic president, what limitations should he or her set on the Justice Department going after all of the sins of this administration? And it's going to require some self-control and some wisdom. And so I don't know. It's tough. What he's doing with the abuse of the Justice Department is going to go down in history. And it's one of the things, you're seeing a lot of retired Republicans that were involved in the criminal justice system stand up and yell bullshit. And I wish that some of the ones that are still involved would be doing it, but they have careers to protect and families to raise and everything else. But
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
So, we're going to wrap it up with you giving us some advice.
what?
What can be done by citizens of your districts to help you stop the destruction to our government agencies, departments, and our rights and benefits by the corrupt Trump regime? Is it heartbreaking and alarming to see what is going on in our country? Thank you for all that you do. What more can I do as a constituent to support you in your work in the House? Do calls, emails, letters to your office really help when I already know you are doing what you can do on the issues that I find important? What is the one thing that we can do to convince our government to make decisions and laws based on evidence-based data and scientific consensus? What can we do as citizens to voice our concerns? And the last question simply states, what can we do?
All right. Well, let's see. Should I go for the easy stuff and the science questions? Yeah, well, look, that's one of the reasons I got into politics, is that you see non-science-based considerations. In reality, every decision you make in politics is a mixture of, science and facts and public opinion. And that, the law is, my father had the saying that the law is only worth a damn if it does what people expect it to do, all right? And that is something that, but whenever you look at an issue, the first thing is, okay, what are the facts? And we have to do everything we can to get a common fact base on this. And that includes a knowledge of history, which is just being massively rewritten, and I think rewritten in an incorrect way by sometimes both sides of the political debate. And I think, one of the miracles of modern society is Wikipedia, which you'd think wouldn't possibly work, and actually works pretty well, as evidenced by the fact that the right wing is now going after Wikipedia for being Wokepedia. But it's remarkable. When you look at all these people that are busy doing their artificial intelligence agents, they say, how do we judge when a statement is true? The best metric they have is how close it is to something that's on Wikipedia. that actually is a pretty decent first starting point. I mean, it's not perfect, and there's, I don't know how the hell they figure out who it is on Wikipedia that gets to write the history of Israel, for example. That must be just a firefight every single day that I'm happy I'm not involved in. But there are a lot of, there is such a thing as generally accepted facts, and that has to be the starting point. And when you see things just deviating from that, I think every citizen has a duty to stand up and yell bullshit, whether it's just a comment by your neighbor or whether it's something that occurs in political debate. That's part of it. The other part of it is I just want to thank you again for the protests. They do more than you might guess, because just because the Republicans don't show up at the protest, and some do. Some have come up to me and said, Bill, I've been voting Republican all my time, but I saw you out at that protest, and thank you. That was the first protest I've ever been in, and thank you for being there too. Okay, and so that that is not nothing. Then get involved politically around the country. You know, you have within a half-hour drive, 40-minute drive, you know, persuadable voters in swing districts in other states, and good candidates that need help. So anyway, I just want to, and you've got a lot of good candidates that are going to make, one of the things that everyone will pay attention to is when Republican strongholds start to fall. That it made a big effect on everyone's opinion of, you know, when all of a sudden, you know, DuPage County, where I live, it used to be that's where all the Republicans went out to raise money. It was the ruby red heartland of Republicanism. And when all of a sudden, you know, Dennis Hastert's seat, which was gerrymandered there, fell to a Democrat, it made a big impression on everyone about the opinion of where things are going. So every election victory, large and small, you know, down in Huntley in McHenry County, there was a school board that was taken over by some not very savory people and not very knowledgeable people. Then they were one-termers. And that was a great, you know, there was just, people said, no, we do not want a school board with that kind of people on it. And, you know, in McHenry County, they're no longer on that board. And so this is the sort of thing that can make a difference, and it gets paid attention to. Even the members of Congress, they at least will listen to their political advisors, and their political advisors will look around at everything happening throughout the country. And if they see that just the needle is moving, it gets noticed. And anyway, so I just want to say thank you again for coming out. This is the way democracy is supposed to work.
I think, and going along with what Congressman Foster said about protest working, we have a big protest rally planned in McHenry. No Kings on October 18th. It will be on Route 31 and McCullum Lake Road from 11 a.m. until 1 p.m. Those of you who were at our last No Kings protest rally in June know that we had 5,000 people at that rally. Let's try and beat it this time. Thank you so much.